The conflict started to rise as the British passed legislation that taxed the Americans while the Americans had no representatives or say in the taxation. The Americans were much smaller than the British's massive empire.
The tensions had been rising for the past few years, and finally they were at a breaking point. The American patriots decided to stockpile weapons in case of conflict. British spies had reported the stockpile of weapons belonging to the colonists, and the British Army decided to seize it.
On April 18, 1775, 700 British troops were sent out from Boston in the dark. The British regulators' goal was to seize the colonial arms. The Sons of Liberty were a patriot group and kept eyes on the British, and as soon as they set out, they alerted their colleagues across the river.
Colonists across the Charles River saw the signal of lanterns and set out messengers on horses to ride through the towns on their way to Concord. One of the messengers was Paul Revere, who rode through each village, waking the colonists, warning them the British were coming.
In Massachusetts, volunteers that were known as Minutemen trained and prepared to fight the British, and on April 19th, about 70 of these Minutemen waited on the Lexington Green under the command of Captain John Parker.
The British ordered the Minutemen to go home and stop resisting. In the conflict, a shot rang out. Nobody knows who fired that shot, but that shot became known as the shot heard around the world. Fighting followed, and when the smoke cleared, 8 colonists lay dead on the green.
The British kept pushing all the way to Concord, but they found no rumored stockpile of arms in the town, and they turned around, heading back for Boston.
On a bridge outside of Concord, approximately 300 Minutemen confronted the British, and then again, fighting broke out between the colonists and the British. This time, the colonists forced a British retreat using their terrain to their advantage.
As the British retreated, they were ambushed all the way back to Boston. Because the British wore red coats, white pants, and white X's on their uniforms, it made it extremely easy for colonial sharpshooters to ambush them in the woods. And some wives even took shots at the British from their homes. Because of these events, a wave of colonial propaganda against the British swept through the 13 colonies. That propaganda gave the colonial movement for independence great momentum and inspired more colonists to stand up against the British.
This also caused the Colonial Congress to have each colony create their own militia to fight the British. These militias were composed mostly of ordinary colonists wanting to help gain freedom. The soldiers were not very well trained or maintained as the British Army per se, but they were able to put up a good fight.
Although the British regulators to seize the colonial arms, it was outrageous that our colonists would dare stand up against the Crown. When we arrived in Lexington, we were met by about 80 to 100 armed colonists blocking our path. But I did not back down. I ordered the colonists to go home and stop resisting. Some of the colonists backed down, but the majority of them stayed put. After a little bit of arguing, a shot rang out. I do not personally know who fired that shot, but I guarantee you none of my men would fire without the order which I did not give. After the fighting, we moved on and made it to Concord, but the rumored stockpile of weapons had been moved and was no longer there. On a bridge outside of Concord, around 300 colonists waited on or around the bridge. After fighting, we were pushed back by the puny American force who did not know any rules of war. As we returned to Boston, we were ambushed all the way back. About 100 soldiers died and another 200 were wounded or missing. It was incredible that a small military force would go against the greatest empire in the world.
After the battles of Lexington and Concord, the congressional delegates sent a letter known as the Olive Branch Petition to the King in England. This was an attempt to repeal the Intolerable Acts and to restore some order. The king was outraged and would not settle for that. He saw the petition as a declaration of war and sent 20,000 troops to the 13 colonies. This response would ultimately convince colonial leaders like John and Sam Adams that war would not be avoidable. This is why Lexington and Concord was the beginning of the Revolutionary War. The term shot heard around the world eventually stuck because it was the first time in colonial history that a colony had stood up against its ruling nation and began a war for freedom.